This video is sponsored by me and you. Find out more at the end. Before I lose your attention, here's how this is going to go. I'll start with an introduction, laying a foundation for the point I'll be making. Then I'll share one verse with you, using it to make said point. Then I'll give you asbab al-nuzul, meaning the context of the verse, which really helps drive my point home. And as a bonus, it highlights some of Prophet Muhammad's many flaws. Sounds good so far? Hit the like button if you like concise videos that don't waste your time. The verse in question is verse 6 of Surah Al-Hujurat. The point is that the Quran is flawed and can be improved, so it fails its own made-up criteria for divinity. In other words, Kathir destroys the Quran with this one trick, yada yada yada, all that good stuff. But I hope that your takeaway is not the dramatized conclusion, but how I arrived at it. Now let's begin by defending the Quran. I've seen some comments and slogans repeated here and there about the Quran, usually but not always said by non-Muslim theists. They're simplistic in nature, categorical condemnations of the book. Things like, the Quran is not a book of wisdom, it's a book of wisdom, or everything in it is false and satanic, or even innocuous verses have hidden evil meanings. I don't think any of that is true. It's not fair to say that the Quran was authored to be a book of outright evil, but it's fair to say that it's a book of parables, as in simplistic stories meant to instruct and convey moral lessons. Most Muslims would disagree and say it also contains historical facts, divine knowledge, and guidance. But it's clear to an investigative non-believer that it's a collection of human ideas, human sentiments, and commands pertaining to a certain area and time. That doesn't mean that it's all bad or entirely too old to be applicable. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. But that's a far cry from the Islamic claim that the Quran is timeless and perfect. If you ask a Muslim apologist or a preacher, how do you know that Islam is the truth? Forget all the arguing about the existence of a God. What evidence do you have that your prophet has anything to do with that God? If they manage to answer that question without whataboutism involving the Holy Trinity or polytheism, they will very likely point to the Quran. They'll point to prophecies and so-called scientific miracles, which are topics for future videos, so do subscribe. And they'll say that the Quran's linguistic eloquence and perfection somehow prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it came from God, not from a human. A book's eloquence and perfection are subjective and difficult to prove, and more importantly have nothing to do with divinity. A good book does not a God make. But let's play along, because you know what is easier to demonstrate than perfection? Imperfection. It's not clear whether every verse in the Quran actually came from Muhammad, or if some verses were intentionally or mistakenly altered by his followers. There's a lot of evidence that points to differences and amendments in the Quran historically, but assuming that it's all exactly how Muhammad recited it, meaning it was preserved, so to speak, there's still absolutely no proof that God, if it exists, communicated it to Muhammad. But I'm not going to delve into all that today because I don't need to. I'll use Islam's arbitrary criterion, perfection, to disprove the Quran's divinity. If there's any room for improvement, then it's imperfect. If it's imperfect, then it's not from God. As simple as that. With the introduction out of the way, let's get to the verse of the day. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا أن تصيبوا قوما بجهالة فتصبحوا على ما فعلتم نادمين. O you who have believed, if there comes to you a disobedient one, with an asterisk, if there comes to you a disobedient one with information, investigate, lest you harm a people out of ignorance and become over what you have done regretful. On the face of it, it seems like a decent nugget of wisdom. Verify the information you receive, don't jump to conclusions, lest you harm someone. Is this Muhammad prophesizing and warning against misinformation and fake news? Is it actually a piece of perfect and timeless wisdom? Well, the author was close. Very close. But he had to mess it up with the word fasiq. It more accurately translates to wicked person, which could apply to a multitude of people. In my opinion, this verse could prime a believer to make a moral judgment about a person, labeling them a fasiq, before assessing the information. So it's not general advice about vetting your sources. Without context, which is nowhere to be found in the verses before or after it, this sounds like an appeal to in-group bias. It says, if a wicked person tells you something, distrust it and be extra skeptical. And that wicked label can apply to a plethora of people in the outgroup, such as non-believers or those who disobey Allah and His Prophet. So read again. If an enemy of Allah tells you something, distrust it, be extra skeptical. Sure, admittedly that may sound like a stretch, as if I'm really nitpicking the wording and misrepresenting the spirit of the verse. But remember, we're seeking absolute perfection. This verse could be closer to that. If we do away with the wicked part, the verse is more widely applicable, more valuable, and less prone to in-group bias. O believers, if you receive information, Double check before you harm someone. But if you think I'm really reaching with the in-group thing, I'll do you one better. The wording of this verse implies a massive blind spot for misinformation from non-wicked people. Think about it. Most of us have relatives who share the wildest alternative facts, so to speak, be it about politics, science, religion, or usually a mishmash of all of the above. And many of us know what it's like to see the most unhinged takes in the family group chat. Are those people wicked? Is your flat earther grandma a wicked person, intentionally spreading misinformation around her wicked group of evil grannies? I really don't think that's the case. I believe that most people have good intentions even when they are wrong. And there definitely are intentional and malicious spreaders of misinformation, but for the most part, it's the non-wicked people who propagate it. This verse fails to warn believers of that scenario and might implicitly be calling anyone who unknowingly shared wrong information a fasiq. How can Allah be so ignorant about the nature of His creation? Why does He categorize people into black and white groups with seemingly very little depth or nuance? Besides, misinformation spreads easier through trusted channels, so to maximize the benefit of the verse, the author should be emphasizing that side of things. I mean, which sounds more valuable to you, especially in today's climate? Be skeptical about what wicked people say, or be skeptical about misinformation from all sources? You don't even need a verse to tell you the former. Humans naturally distrust someone they perceive to be wicked. As you can tell by the runtime of this video, I'm not done with this verse just yet. I want to give the author the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps he meant to combine the two lessons. Beware of misinformation and intentionally spreading it is wicked. So he shorthanded it into beware of misinformation from a wicked person. If that was the author's intention, then as much slack as I'm prepared to cut him, I have to acknowledge that he could have worded it better. This phrasing sacrifices clarity for the sake of brevity. And if I'm writing my last shot at a perfect guidebook and I had to pick one or the other, I'll choose clarity over brevity every time. Regardless of the author's intentions, every way you look at it, there absolutely is room for improvement that'll make this verse more useful, precise, and timeless. So why did the author specify fasiq? Perhaps the author's feelings got in the way. Perhaps he was really misled by someone and felt the urge to let off some steam. Perhaps I've got the receipts to show for it. The first 5 verses of Surah Al-Hujurat basically tell people to obey Muhammad, and the verses talk crap about those who misbehave. Then there's the verse in question. Then 2 verses glorifying Muhammad. Then a few verses about getting along and not backbiting, because that's akin to cannibalism. A bit graphic, but okay, message received. And lastly, some verses to re-emphasize the importance of obeying Muhammad. It's not enough to be a believing Muslim. The truthful Muslims are the ones without doubt who give their lives and wealth to the cause of Allah. Keeping members perpetually striving for an upgrade sounds very culty, but let's not get into that right now. I urge you to read the verses yourself with multiple translations, because the intention of this recap is not to summarize them, but to demonstrate how little context there is for the verse in question. There's nothing here to tell us more about Muhammad's state of mind when he supposedly received the verse, or more about the events that preceded it. But if you consult the Tafsir, the exegesis written by Muslim scholars like tabari, Qurtubi, and Ibn Kathir, that's where you'll find the context. There's multiple variations of this story, but here's the gist of it from Tafsir tabari. Muhammad sent a man to collect zakah from a tribe. The man is likely Al-Walid bin Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayt, and the tribe is likely Bani al-Muttaliq. In a nutshell, zakah is a religious obligation on every Muslim to pay 2.5% of their savings annually to charity. These days it's not enforced by a government entity, but back then it was enforced and collected by the heads of tribes on a local level and the leader of the Islamic State on a state level. If it sounds like an MLM scheme or extortion, it's not supposed to be, but we'll get to that in a minute. So Muhammad sent a man to collect zakah from a tribe. The tribe excitedly came out to meet the collector, thinking that the Prophet himself was visiting them, and that spooked him, and Shaitan, the devil, told him that these people are out to kill him, so he fled back and told Muhammad that they refused to pay. It's funny how Shaitan is the fall guy for anything and everything in these stories. Forgot about a fish? Shaitan. Misremembered a verse? Shaitan. Your food is overcooked. You guessed it. Shaitan. Anyway, Muhammad got severely angry by the news and was debating with himself whether he should conquer the tribe for their disobedience. Lucky for the tribe, they were already on their way to investigate what happened, because they were concerned since the collector never actually met with them, so they feared that it's a sign of danger, and they sought refuge in Allah from His anger and the anger of His Prophet. I'm not paraphrasing to make Muhammad look bad. These are the accounts from the ahadith mentioned in the tafsir. فَغَضِبَ غَضَبًا شَدِيدًا فَبَيْنَمَا هُوَ يُحَدِّثُ نَفْسَهُ أَنْ يَغْزُوهُمْ and so on. These people were fearful of Muhammad's anger if he didn't get his money. That's some scary mafia stuff. I didn't know that refusing to pay zakat to Muhammad was grounds for takfir and invasion. And if he was ready to conquer a converted Muslim tribe over 2.5% of their savings, can you imagine what Muhammad and his posse did to the tribes who didn't bow down to them? Here's a trigger warning. I'll be going on a tangent about Islamic wars, and I'll be mentioning violence, slavery, and assault. Skip to this timestamp if you wish. When Muhammad and his followers invade a people, they kill the disobedient and enslave the women, children, and whoever else is left. Those slaves can be kept, slept with if they're women, traded, and sold. And all the people's property is confiscated and considered war booty. And the lion's share of it, at least a fifth according to the Quran, goes to God and the Prophet and poor people and orphans, which is a smart way of whitewashing the money. Just throw in a few causes by name. Many Muslims believe that Muhammad only fought in defensive wars, but that is absolutely false. In this example alone, he was livid and ready to fight a war over money he thinks he's owed. And in terms of his methods, it's pretty much what a certain Islamic State organization does. Believers can argue that their motivation or their choice of victim are not Islamically sound, but the brutality of their methods and the fate of their victims are largely the same. Murder, slavery, and sex slavery are all things that Muhammad himself and his followers participated in by their own admission. Again, these are not conspiracy theories. This is stuff from the Quran, the Hadith, and the Seerah. There's a lot more that can be said about Muhammad's profitable war machine, but for the sake of brevity, I'll get back to the point. There are several variants to this backstory. In one variation, the collector accused the tribe of kufr, meaning apostasy, so Muhammad sent spies who found the tribe praying and disproved that allegation, which is incredibly ironic since he preaches in the same surah that Muslims shouldn't spy on each other. In yet another narration, the collector pocketed the money on top of accusing them of apostasy and refusing to pay, and when the tribe denied it, Muhammad didn't believe them till the verse was allegedly revealed. In another narration, the collector even accused the tribe of planning to attack Muhammad and his people. And in another one, it was the Muslims who egged on Muhammad to fight the war, as if he's a weak-willed person who's swayed by his followers, not a wise prophet. There are many versions of this story, and none of them are in the Quran. But the one common theme in all these stories is that Muhammad is a hothead, and with the Quran and his followers, he spread fear among the tribes and extorted them for zakah money. If Muhammad's anger and readiness for war in this one incident was based on a misunderstanding, because the collector feared his safety, then the collector is not a wicked person, he was just paranoid, and Muhammad needs to calm down. This verse is useless in that scenario because the collector isn't a fasiq. If he was indeed malicious, then the verse still sucks because it wouldn't have warned Muhammad against that scenario in the future. He didn't initially think the collector was a fasiq, or else he wouldn't have sent him on that mission. So investigate information from a fasiq still doesn't apply. The backstory helps contextualize this verse very well because it shows how after narrowly avoiding an unnecessary war with a submissive tribe, Muhammad's anger was still present in the verse. Maybe he was angry at himself. Maybe he was angry at the collector and subtweeted him as a fasiq, tainting this potentially wise verse with his flawed reaction and making it a very specific verse when it could have been more broad and applicable. To me, this verse is more akin to a hit piece or a rant than a useful nugget of wisdom. If you think of the Quran as a regularly updated local newsletter, this reads like a headline with no article. Fasiq spreads misinformation, crisis narrowly averted. It also reads like a cryptic Facebook rant devoid of any context, with the explanation only coming from what he said and she said. The point of this video isn't to say that this verse is the most abhorrent thing to ever exist, but I hope that I demonstrated that it can at least be written better. It has the markings of an emotionally reactive human author, which I have bested by slightly altering the verse. There's nothing perfect or divine about it. The Quran was written reactively to explain and control events happening around the Prophet, which doesn't on its own disqualify its claim of divinity. But given the absence of any proof for such claim, I'm forced to draw the painfully obvious conclusion that it wasn't a book written by God before creating space and time. An apologist could and will argue that any text is bound to be misinterpreted eventually, so it's not the author's fault, but the reader's, to which I'd only partially agree and thank them for acknowledging that cryptic texts riddled with flaws and devoid of context are not the best way to send a clear, universal, and final message to humanity. Allah should have known better. The onus falls on the author to make their words as understandable and incorruptible as possible. We cannot in good faith say that this verse is bulletproof and that the negative conclusion is a far stretch. This verse is demonstrated time and time again with how insular and rigid religious communities tend to be towards any information that disagrees with their worldview because it's coming from a fasiq. So in a sense, this verse is poor if its purpose is to warn disbelievers of dangers of misinformation, spreading rumors and false accusations. It leaves a huge blind spot for misinformation to come from good people, and it basically says, be extra skeptical around the wicked. But this verse is pretty good if its purpose is to grow distrust against the outgroup, or if its purpose was for Muhammad to deflect blame and let off steam after almost starting a war. Thank you for watching, and as always, think critically, and think for yourself. Wait, before you go, I'm adding a section to this video for some rambling and afterthoughts, things that couldn't fit in earlier. First, I made this video after being inspired by Hassan Radwan's article called Improving the Quran. I suggest you check out his articles. They're informative and straight to the point, so links are in the description. Second, I wanted to make it clear that none of what I said is an unfair character assassination of Muhammad. I'm citing Muslim scholars who cite Muhammad's followers. The lovey-dovey, flawless, Jesus-like image Muslims have of Muhammad is so far from the truth. I learned that everything he did was amazing and he could do absolutely no wrong. But as I demonstrate in every video, Muhammad had many flaws, and he didn't die a peaceful shepherd with a couple dozen followers. But unfortunately, like most cults, the followers work back from the conclusion that the leader is correct and he could do no wrong. So any opposing evidence is either dismissed or rationalized away. This story was a close call. He didn't raid or kill anyone, but there are many other verified stories where he did. And his followers struggle to see him as a warlord because they're working back from the conclusion that he's flawless. And remember what I said about how we're not sure about what verses he actually dictated? Well, Tafsir tabari shows that this verse too had multiple variants, but they're close in meaning. So most Muslims don't realize how sloppy this actually is, and they believe that every word is preserved just as Muhammad revealed it. Allah. And they also don't realize that the Quran doesn't make much sense without what the he said, she said hadith, which contains even more variation. And I don't fault the average believer for not knowing all this. Life gets busy and there's a lot to know, but I urge you to look into it yourself because it's not a perfect man and a perfect book, like we are led to believe, but a terribly messy house of cards. Religious preachers don't like you asking too many questions and zooming in on the details, claiming that the devil is in the details and doubt is in the details. And you should ignore the controversy. I disagree. I think that truth is in the details, so please seek the truth. I'm sorry for not being able to publish more frequently than every 2 weeks. I like to be diligent and there's just too much to research before I can confidently share my thoughts. And none of that would be possible without your support. So I'd like to thank you all for your viewership, and a special thanks to patrons, YouTube members, and donors for affording me the time I need to make these videos. All that being said, thanks again for watching, and consider watching one of these videos next. Should I say it again? Think critically and think for yourself.